What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My father raised a glass to my sister at her graduation dinner and announced, in front of everyone, that she was his one true success, the child he was proud of, the proof that his parenting had worked. The room filled with polite laughter, with some relatives clapping and nodding, while I sat there trying not to show how much it stung. I had been through this kind of thing before, but hearing it said so bluntly, in public, with me right there at the same table, left me staring at the untouched plate in front of me. I wanted to believe I could just let it slide, that maybe I had misheard him, but then he doubled down and made a little joke about how not everyone in the family had the same drive as Lena, and some of us were still finding ourselves. I am in my 30s, with a career that pays well, a house, a marriage, and bills that I pay without asking anyone for help. My sister is younger, yes, and finishing her degree is something to be proud of, but the fact that he used her moment as an excuse to erase me completely pushed something in me past the breaking point. I did not have to say anything, because Evan, my husband, had clearly been waiting for this kind of opening. He leaned back in his chair, as calm as could be, and said in a steady voice, "Interesting, because here is proof you have been living off her salary." You could have heard the silverware hit the plates when people froze. My father's smile disappeared in a flash, as if Evan had flipped a switch. Evan pulled a thin folder from his bag and set it right on the table. Inside were printouts of the recurring transfers I had been making for more than 2 years. There were mortgage shortfall payments, utilities that mysteriously came due on my account, and a credit card where my father was an authorized user, racking up charges at restaurants and golf outings. Evan even highlighted the dates that matched up perfectly with the nights my father claimed to be networking for business opportunities. My father immediately tried to laugh it off, saying family helps family and that I was making more than I needed, so of course it was only natural that I pitch in. But the relatives looking at those papers were not laughing anymore. They were connecting dots they had never questioned before. My sister looked confused, blinking like she had just been told something impossible. She whispered, "Dad, what is he talking about?" and he snapped at her to keep quiet. I cleared my throat and finally spoke, not loudly, not angrily, just very matter-of-fact. I said that for over 2 years I had covered the gap in their mortgage, so the house would not go into default. I said I had paid for utilities when they were past due because I could not stand the thought of my mother sitting in the dark. I said that when Lena's scholarship did not cover her last semester, the tuition bill had come to me, and I had paid it without telling her because I did not want her to feel guilty. And I said that every single time I had been told it was temporary, that I would be paid back, and that I should not tell anyone else because it would embarrass him. The silence that followed was so sharp it was almost unbearable. My mother's eyes darted to the floor, my sister looked like she wanted to cry, and my father's face went red as he muttered something about family secrets and not airing private matters in public. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "You made it public when you humiliated me at this table." Then, without waiting for his response, I pulled out my phone, opened the banking app, and with 2 taps I froze the credit card he had been using under my account. Another tap, and the recurring transfers were canceled. No more quiet lifeline, no more safety net for his ego. My husband squeezed my hand under the table, and for the first time in years I felt the weight shifting. My father tried to continue the dinner, pouring himself more wine and forcing out a story, but nobody was really listening. The air had changed. The relatives were whispering to each other. My sister kept staring at me as if she was realizing her entire understanding of our family finances had been wrong, and my mother's hands trembled as she tried to cut her food. I sat still, calm, almost detached, because in that moment, for the first time, I was not the one carrying the shame. I leaned back and thought to myself that the performance was finally over, and the truth was out there whether he liked it or not. The only thing left was for the bill to arrive, and this time it was going to land in front of the right person. By the time I woke up the next morning, the group chat had already turned into a noisy arena where half the family declared that last night had been a misunderstanding caused by stress and wine, while the other half asked careful questions that sounded polite on the surface, but carried the same old assumption that My father could not possibly have done anything truly wrong because men like him simply made mistakes with good intentions, and in the middle of all that noise my phone kept buzzing with notifications that tried to pull me into arguments I had no interest in repeating because I had already explained myself more times than I could count and had spent years pretending that silence was maturity when really it had just been exhaustion. I brewed coffee and read every message without responding because I wanted to see where the lines would be drawn when I did not do the usual emotional labor of smoothing things over, and what I saw was a chorus of familiar strategies, an aunt urging grace, a cousin suggesting that successful families handle problems privately, an uncle reminiscing about how my father had helped him move house 20 years ago, as if that single weekend could cancel out more than 2 years of bills landing quietly in my lap. And tucked between those attempts at revision were 2 or 3 surprise notes from relatives who had looked at the folder Evan placed on the table and could not unsee the dates and the amounts and the way the charges matched the stories my father told about networking dinners that always somehow ended with my card paying the check. Evan took the phone from my hand and told me that I did not have to explain anything to anyone, which should have made me feel better, but what I felt instead was a steady, practical sort of clarity. The kind that shows up after a storm when the debris is still everywhere yet the shape of the street finally makes sense again. So I opened the chat and wrote a single message that had no theatrics and no anger, just a simple line stating that I would not debate feelings, that I would only share facts, and that anyone who wanted to understand what happened could look at the following screenshots and make their own conclusions. I posted 3 images in a row, each clean and readable, with dates spelled out, with the bank's language displayed plainly, with my father's own texts beside the transfers where he first called them temporary help, then an allowance that I could afford because I was unmarried at the time and supposedly had no real responsibilities, and finally a message that flat out said I owed him as his daughter because he had raised me, which carried the kind of logic that only works when no one asks who raised the electricity bill, or who raised the last semester's tuition when the scholarship conditions changed. I wrote short captions that did not editorialize, because the truth carries its own weight when you stop padding it with apologies. Within minutes, the chat splintered into 2 currents, one that tried to drag me into the long-time family habit of calling exploitation generosity, and another quieter current where the relatives who had been ignored for years found their voice and asked direct questions that my father could not answer without contradicting the story he loved to tell about being the head of a household he did not actually fund. And while that unfolded, my mother called and whispered that everything was getting out of hand, that people were talking, that my father was embarrassed, and I said that I understood her fear, but I would not put the lid back on a pot that had been boiling dry on my stove while I kept refilling it with my paycheck. And if peace was possible, it would be built on truth or not at all. Lena texted me separately, and the messages came in bursts, as if she was pacing with the phone in her hand, saying she had assumed Dad handled the tuition because he insisted he would, that she never wanted me to cover it in secret, that if she had known she would have taken another campus job, and beneath her confusion I could hear the grief that comes when a daughter realizes the stories she grew up with were written by someone who needed applause more than he needed accuracy. So I told her exactly what I had done, when I had done it, and why I had never asked her to repay a cent, because I wanted her to graduate without that burden and because the debt did not belong to her. When the chat reached a peak of chaotic energy, with a cousin trying to schedule a family call so everyone could reset the energy, I decided on the smallest, cleanest move I could make that would change the dynamic without feeding the fire. So I edited the group description to read, in a line that took only a few seconds to type, "Financial questions should go to the person who actually paid the bills." Then I muted the thread for the rest of the day, and the silence that followed was not a retreat, it was a boundary made visible. Evan kissed the top of my head and said that the quiet would flush out who wanted facts and who wanted fables, and he was right, because within an hour 2 aunts sent private apologies that sounded stunned rather than defensive. One uncle asked if there was a way to help my mother separate her accounts so she would not be dragged into consequences that were not hers, and my phone finally lit up with a single message from my father that contained no greeting, no explanation, and no plan, just a Sentence that read, written out as words instead of shorthand, that I had cost him his reputation, as if a reputation is a fragile heirloom that daughters are obligated to polish, while fathers spend it on dinners and speeches. And as I stared at that sentence, I felt a calm resolve settle in because the next step would not be noise in a chat. It would be action in the real world where paperwork speaks louder than toasts, and where the person who opens the wallet also gets to close it. When I walked into the bank later that week, I carried not only the documents Evan and I had carefully collected, but also a new determination that I had never allowed myself to feel before, because for years I had been the one quietly signing the checks, paying the overdue balances, and patching holes in accounts that were not mine, and I had convinced myself that doing so made me mature and responsible, but standing in front of the banker and asking to remove my father as an authorized user on my card was the first time I openly admitted that being mature did not mean being exploited. The banker asked if I was certain, reminding me that removing him would cut off access immediately, and I said that certainty was the only reason I was sitting in that chair. So with a few signatures, the line that had given him permission to drain me without consequences was gone. After that appointment, I sat in the car with Evan and felt the strange combination of relief and anger. Relief that I had finally put a stop to the bleeding, and anger that it had taken so long. But instead of spiraling into self-blame, I decided to keep moving forward, because this was not about regretting the past, but about correcting the present. We drove straight to my office, where I scheduled a meeting with HR to review my entire employment file, something most people never think to do. But I needed to be absolutely sure that no dependent or beneficiary information had been manipulated in a way that could give my father access to more than he already had. The HR manager was polite, almost surprised by the level of detail I demanded, but when I explained that unauthorized hands had been near my finances before, she nodded with an understanding that told me she had seen worse. And she confirmed line by line that no one but me had control of my paychecks, insurance, or retirement contributions. From there I went to a tax professional, because I realized that the quiet transfers I had made over the years were not just family favors, they were money with consequences. And I needed those consequences documented in a way that could not be twisted into some fabricated story later. The accountant listened carefully as I laid out the pattern: monthly mortgage gap payments, utility bailouts, and tuition coverage, all backed by bank statements and my father's own text messages. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and admiration before explaining that we could file amended returns, reclassifying the transfers not as gifts but as loans supported by written acknowledgement. And she smiled when I showed her the casual handwritten note my father had once scribbled that literally said, "Temporary loans, I'll pay you back." That note, which I had kept out of equal parts bitterness and hope, became the backbone of a paper trail that would finally make the truth enforceable. When I left her office, I called my father not to argue but to inform him. I told him that I had taken steps to formalize everything, that repayment would be structured, that there was no more pretending money had disappeared into the fog of family obligation, and that he would receive documents outlining exactly what he owed and how it would be tracked. He laughed in a way that sounded more like a sneer, told me I would never go through with it, and said that I was being dramatic, as if the numbers on the page were simply an act in a show he refused to watch. I did not take the bait. I told him the repayment plan was already drafted, the accounts were already amended, and the paperwork had already been filed, so whether he acknowledged it or not, the process was moving forward. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Evan and laid out the repayment schedule we had drafted with the accountant's help. The terms were not cruel. They were reasonable installments that any adult with a steady income could handle if they prioritized properly. We even included a note that said if he stayed current for 2 consecutive years, the remainder would be forgiven, not because I owed him kindness, but because I wanted him to know that honesty had rewards too. We printed it on plain paper, signed our names, and mailed it with delivery confirmation so that he could never claim he had not received it. As I sealed the envelope, I thought about all the years when I believed the only way to keep peace was to carry the weight myself, and how that belief had turned into silence that allowed him to rewrite history at dinners and parties while I smiled and pretended it did not hurt. Sending that envelope felt like sending back the shame he had piled on me for years, neatly packed with documentation that told the truth without a single raised voice. When he received the letter 2 days later, his response came in the form of a message that consisted of nothing more than the phrase "laughing out loud" spelled out, followed by the line, "You will never follow through." It was a strange kind of relief to read it, because for once his denial did not unsettle me, it clarified the path ahead. I did not need him to believe me. I only needed to proceed, because this was not about convincing him anymore. It was about proving to myself that I would never again confuse being a good daughter with being a financial hostage. And as I put my phone down, I realized that the next steps were no longer about internal corrections or silent boundaries, but about what happens when truth meets reputation, because while paperwork moves quietly through offices, reputations unravel loudly in public, and he was about to learn what that felt like. The first sign that my father's carefully maintained image was beginning to collapse did not come from him directly, but from the silence that followed his usual stream of self-congratulatory posts on social media. Because where he once would write long captions about networking events or dinners with important contacts, suddenly the update slowed and then stopped, replaced by a vague status about betrayal and ungrateful children that, instead of winning him sympathy, drew a noticeable lack of engagement from the very relatives and acquaintances who once filled the comment section with applause. I noticed quickly that those who had seen the screenshots in the family chat were no longer willing to lend their public support, because once numbers are attached to stories, even the most loyal defenders hesitate to put their name behind a narrative that looks hollow. It was not only online where the cracks showed. Within days, a cousin who had invited my father to a community fundraiser quietly rescinded the invitation, explaining in a private message to me that he could not risk associating with someone whose financial reputation was now under question. And though the message was framed politely, it was obvious that word was spreading faster than my father could control it. My father, of course, ranted about conspiracies and disrespect, insisting that I had orchestrated some campaign to humiliate him. But the truth was that I did not have to lift a finger beyond presenting the facts, because the facts themselves were corrosive to the kind of myth he had built, and no amount of charm or bluster could cover the stains once people saw them. The hardest part was my sister, because Lena confronted me one evening with tears in her eyes, asking in a trembling voice whether it was really true that I had covered her tuition during her last semester when my father swore up and down that he had handled it. I told her everything plainly, not with bitterness toward her but with honesty, explaining that I had stepped in because her scholarship conditions changed, and when she asked why no one told her, I admitted that I had wanted to protect her from guilt. Though in hindsight, I realized protecting her also protected my father's story. She broke down crying, not because she felt indebted to me, but because she realized she had lived her final months of college under a false impression, celebrating her graduation as though it were funded by his stability rather than by my quiet sacrifices, and the betrayal in her expression was not directed at me but at him, which was a wound he could not repair with speeches. My mother, meanwhile, became quieter with every passing day, until finally she called me late one night and asked for help setting up her own bank account, something she had never done independently because my father always insisted it was unnecessary. I drove over the next morning, sat with her at the kitchen table, and guided her through opening an account in her name only, teaching her how to check balances online and how to monitor transactions so she would never again be blind to what came in and out. Watching her hands tremble as she held the debit card, I realized how much she had allowed herself to depend on a man who lived off others while convincing everyone he was the provider. And in that moment, I saw not only a wife learning too late, but also a woman finally reclaiming a sliver of autonomy. As these private changes unfolded, I decided to take a step further and protect Lena from future manipulation, so I set up a small tuition fund in her name, one that I contributed to directly with modest sums, making it clear that only she and I had access, and that our father would never be able to touch it or redirect it for his own purposes. It was not about the money itself, but about creating a structure where she could feel supported without being tied to his illusions. And when I showed her the paperwork, she hugged me in a way that said she finally understood the difference between showmanship and actual support. I thought this would be the natural end of the spiral, with his reputation eroded and his control slipping, but then my tax professional called me one afternoon with a calm but serious tone, explaining that while reviewing the amended returns she had discovered another issue tied to my father's use of my financial information, one that could not be ignored and would need to be addressed quickly. She advised me that it would be better for him to hear it directly from me before the agency contacted him, because once it reached that stage the consequences would be out of my hands entirely. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, realizing that the confrontation I had tried to avoid might now become unavoidable, because while I had wanted to keep the process clean and private, my father's arrogance had left fingerprints in places that no longer allowed for secrecy. Evan looked at me across the table and asked if I was ready, and I told him that ready was no longer the question, because the moment had already arrived. What I had done so far was about boundaries and repayment, but what was coming next would test whether my father was capable of facing truth at all, or whether he would continue clinging to the myth even as it collapsed around him. And for the first time I felt a strange anticipation rather than fear, because I knew that whatever happened, I was no longer the one carrying the burden. When the moment finally came to confront my father face to face, I realized that all the small battles we had fought in messages, at dinners, and in the quiet spaces of financial records were only preludes to the real decision point. Because no matter how many receipts I had collected or how many steps I had already taken to remove his access to my accounts, the only way to end this cycle once and for all was to put the truth in front of him in a way that he could neither deny nor escape. Evan and I arranged to meet him in a neutral setting, not at the family home where my mother's eyes would plead for calm, not at a restaurant where he could perform for an audience, but in a rented conference room at a small office center where the only props were the papers I carried and the silence that would follow if he chose not to speak. I sat across from him and slid a single sheet of paper across the table, a document that contained two clear options. Either he signed the repayment acknowledgement and agreed to a reasonable plan that would allow him to restore a measure of dignity by paying back what he owed, or he refused, in which case I would proceed with the filings and claims that would bring the matter into courtrooms and offices, where charm meant nothing and evidence meant everything. He tried to laugh at first, making a show of leaning back and mocking the formality of the paper, but I stayed silent and let him talk himself into a corner, because the more he tried to diminish the seriousness, the more obvious it became that the ground beneath him was crumbling. When he saw that neither I nor Evan would rise to his bait, he shifted tactics, accusing me of cruelty, suggesting that I was punishing him for loving my sister more, and even hinting that the family would fracture forever if I went through with this. I told him calmly that love was not what had been at issue, because no one had asked him to choose favorites in speeches, but responsibility was not negotiable, and pretending that bills vanished into thin air while secretly leaning on me was not love. It was theft dressed up in the language of family duty. Evan said nothing during this exchange, but his steady presence reminded my father that this was no longer just me against him. It was me supported, documented, and unwilling to back down. Eventually, when his words failed to unsettle me, he stared at the paper again and realized that the lines were written in the kind of language that agencies and courts would respect, and that if he refused to sign, his denial would not protect him from the cascade of consequences that were already set in motion. With a shaky hand he scrawled his signature, muttered something about doing this for the family, and shoved the paper back toward me, but the act itself was an admission that his era of control had ended, because the story he had repeated for years about being the provider could not survive the reality of a repayment plan he had been forced to accept. The next test came when I told him that the acknowledgement would not stay private. I explained that at Lena's farewell gathering before she left for her new job, he would need to read a short statement acknowledging the truth so that the people who had listened to his speeches and swallowed his stories would finally hear something closer to honesty. He blustered again, saying it was unnecessary humiliation, but I told him very directly that the humiliation had already happened at my expense for years, and this was not about vengeance, but about clarity, because I would not allow my sister to leave thinking her education had been paid by magic or by the man who had merely posed as the provider. On the evening of the gathering, he stood in front of the small circle of family members, his voice strained but steady enough to get through the brief statement where he admitted that I had carried the mortgage, utilities, and tuition at critical moments, and that without me the family would have faced consequences he had long pretended did not exist. He stopped short of offering a real apology, but the words themselves were enough to tilt the balance of perception, and I saw the shift in the eyes of the relatives who finally understood why I had chosen to fight back. My mother kept her gaze on the floor, my father's pride cracked as he folded the paper and sat down, and Lena looked directly at me with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, finally freed from the false narrative that had weighed on her achievements. Then came the moment I had prepared for most carefully. I pulled out a small printed ledger that contained every payment I had made on Lena's behalf, line after line of tuition fees, book costs, and living expenses, and in front of everyone I tore it in half and said that she owed me nothing, that the debt was not hers to carry, and that she should walk into her future unburdened. The gesture was not dramatic for its own sake. It was a deliberate act of liberation, showing her that my fight was not with her, and that the ledger of responsibility sat squarely with the man who had chosen image over truth. The silence that followed was heavy, but for once it was not suffocating, because it carried the weight of clarity rather than confusion. As the evening ended, I walked out without looking back at my father's face, because I did not need to see whether he was angry or ashamed. The only thing that mattered was that the rules had changed permanently. I was no longer the quiet daughter who patched holes in silence, nor the reluctant financier of someone else's ego, but the person who had closed the tab and redrawn the boundaries of what family meant. Evan took my hand, my mother hugged me briefly as if she was apologizing without words, and my sister whispered thank you with a kind of conviction that erased years of silence. The victory was not loud, it was not cruel, and it was not about revenge for its own sake. It was about ending the cycle, about proving that emotional justice can be as clean as a single page signed under pressure, and about showing that even the most entrenched myths can collapse when faced with steady truth. As I walked away that night, I felt no need for celebration, because the quiet knowledge that I had finally turned the tables was enough, and the brilliance of that final move was not in how it hurt him, but in how it freed me.